Hey everyone, welcome to Ask a Political Scientist. I am Andrea Jones-Rooy, your host, and this is this week's version of Ask a Political Scientist. We are standing with Black Lives Matter. All proceeds that we normally collect donations during these shows. All donations that come in tonight through the link in the comments and the live chat will all go to Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. And we are here to talk about protests and race and political change with some really amazing guests who I will introduce, and then we'll kick off the conversation. So political science is using scientific methods to understand politics and then being totally ignored by policymakers, voters, and everybody else, including my own family. And part of the reason that we've put together this show, this is our 12th show, is to get the good news in terms of research methods, not necessarily in terms of our research results, but to get our excitement about the importance of political science out there in the world. And I think no other time has it ever been more important to get the findings from political science research out there in the world as it is right now. And our guests today are going to help us talk about how to do this. So our three topics that we are going to be covering today will align very closely with the title for today's show. We are talking about race, we're talking about protests, and we're talking about political change. My political science guest today is Omar Wasso. He is a professor of politics at Princeton University. He earned his PhD in African American studies at Harvard, as well as 2 masters in statistics and in government. He is a fellow at the Aspen Institute and has been a fellow with the NSF, National Science Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, Omar is not just any political scientist. Many of the political scientists I have on this show are like me, which is they went to undergrad and then maybe had a few jobs. I didn't, went straight to grad school, and that's it. Omar has done an incredible quantity of things, even before the incredible things that he has done in political science research that we'll be talking about tonight. So I just want to flag some of his insane accomplishments. He is the co-founder of blackplanet.com. Under his leadership, blackplanet.com became the largest social networking site for Black Americans. He also co-founded the Brooklyn Excelsior Charter School in Brooklyn. He, for many years, was a regular on pretty much every TV channel and radio channel that you can think of. He was talking about, demystifying technology and making the rounds. And if you go to his website and or just search for him, Omar, you have a Googleable name, which I'm grateful for today. There's a lot of great clips of Omar making his rounds on these sites. He was very popular on the Today Show in particular. He also appeared on the Colbert Report. Here he is explaining cyber warfare to Stephen Colbert, who previously had spent about 3 minutes trying to log into the internet on that ancient-looking computer. So you can watch that clip as well. And he is the reason Oprah knows how to use the internet. So Omar, we have to have a whole separate show about exactly what went down and how you ended up being Omar's internet guru. But here she is about to check email for the very first time, screaming, "This is big!" And Omar was like, click on the thing. He was then a repeating guest to talk about technology on Oprah's show. After all that, he became a political scientist. Aren't we lucky to have him in political science? We are here to talk about 2 of his huge research papers that are just stunningly incredible. The first one came out recently in the annual review of political science called Race as a Bundle of Sticks, which is how do we measure and think about race in political science research. And we're going to start off our conversation talking about this. And a paper that literally just came out right before everything in this country changed in the last couple of weeks that we're going to talk about at length today, Agenda Seeding, How 1960s Black Protests Moved Elites, Public Opinion, and Voting. And not surprisingly, it has been picked up already by every outlet. So whatever outlet you like to read to get your news, there's either an interview with Omar or a video or something that he's written, and it's awesome. So please, everyone who is watching, join me in welcoming to the show Omar Wasso. Omar, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good. It's been a crazy couple of weeks, but I am grateful to have this work in the world and that I might be able to contribute to this really important moment of thinking about how does change happen.
Well, I think you already have contributed by getting this out here, and I'm so thrilled that there's so much attention on political science research right now. And just we're going to bring on our second guest in just a moment, but the timing of this article is incredible. I mean, it literally just came out, and the American Political Science Association is the top. I'm sorry, the APSR is the top journal in political science these things come out every quarter. The review process is insane. How did this timing come about?
Yeah, I've been working on this for basically 15 years, and it has been, and it's been a hard road. It got rejected multiple times. I almost walked away from the profession. So it's just, I am very lucky that it made it, and that it made it at a time where it might be useful.
It's incredible. We are all lucky, and yeah, I want to hear from the reviewers that turned that down. I have some choice words for them. I hope their regret is of fifth Beatles level category at the moment. Omar, we're going to bring on our second guest. Does that sound good?
Wonderful.
Perfect. All right. Our next guest coming to the show, representing all non-political scientists ever in the whole world, is a good friend of mine, comedian, writer, producer, Drexton Clemens.
Hey.
Drexton. Oh, hey, Drex. What's up? I'm going to say a couple weird things about you. Is that okay?
That sounds good.
All right, cool. All right, so Drex, this is your life. You, since you came to New York, because that's where my memory begins. So you have performed at the A3C Festival and Conference. That was in Atlanta. Drex is originally from the Atlanta area. The 2019 Harlem Comedy Festival and the DC Comedy Festival, among others. Feel free to fact check me at any point. Drex co-hosts several comedy shows and co-produces them. One of them, most recently, is Chopped Cheese, hosted by Drex and Rashad Bashir, another awesome comedian here in New York City. And back when we all went to bars, like it was no big deal. It was at Harlem Nights Bar, and everyone should go check out that show when we come back. He also co-produces the See Something, Say Something comedy show, which does comedy shows all over the city, including the New York subway and Washington Square Park. And you can follow both of those shows on Instagram. I personally am, I don't know. I'm self-appointed biggest fan in the world, but I'm sure you have bigger fans than me on Instagram. Drex posts these massive Instagram stories way more frequently than I don't even know how you have time for any of them, much less to do them as often as you do, which are these like crazy research papers with images and videos and interactive questions that cover amazingly complex topics in extremely thoughtful ways. I learn from them every time they come up. Some of the recent ones that I've highlighted: coronavirus and the economy, pride and corporations' participation in pride, and cancel culture. So jump on Instagram and follow this guy Drex right this second. He also has a debut album out, his debut comedy album, and Another Thing. You can find it on Amazon. You can buy it on Amazon, and you can find it all over. Drex is awesome. Drex, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Did I do okay with your bio? How was that?
That was amazing. I felt good. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to stand up to the guy who read Oprah's email, but I feel pretty good.
Pretty good. Rest assured, like when Oprah opens her inbox, it's like, oh, here's an email from like Bill G at Microsoft.com, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of low status there too.
Her first email, I think, it was like Bill Gates, Hillary Clinton, and yeah. So I was like, well, damn it. So we're all just going to talk about how we're lower status than Oprah. Drex, how are you doing?
I'm good. Good, but tired. I feel like mentally exhausted with the week, I've been out protesting all week, or at least trying to help out as much as I can at the protest. And I took today off to really be home. So it feels good to be home. Yeah. Good.
Well, I'm glad you're home. I'm glad you're safe. I'm also glad you've been out protesting. How were the protests? How were your experiences doing that?
Overwhelmingly peaceful, which is great, right? Because a lot of the narrative in the news is that they aren't. The protests are peaceful until nighttime, and I feel like that's when the cops tend to antagonize a little bit more. I was out there the first night in Union Square, where it felt almost like an all-out war. That night. I almost got arrested. I made it out.
The night with cars are on fire, all of that.
Yeah, all those.
That narrows it down, but that's.
They were like trash cans on fire. They were, stomping out cars, but a lot of it had been the fact that all day, because we had walked from 125th Street down to City Hall, there were moments that got really tense with the cops. They would charge at us, we'd run, we'd reconvene, and continue on moving. And so I think that the images that you see at the end of it were just a culmination of so many things happening that day that, and of course with everything that's going on, where people were a little bit fed up. And so I think that was probably one of the worst nights of of everything. But after that, it's been overwhelmingly peaceful. I hear about a little, skirmishes here and there with the police, but it seems that they're giving people a little bit more freedom to protest, and the protests have been overwhelmingly peaceful. So that's good.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And Omar, we have a lot to discuss about peaceful versus non-peaceful protests, and peaceful and non-peaceful because of whom, I think. So Omar, let's dive in. I want to talk first about race. So that'll just take a few minutes, right? I want to talk about your paper, Race as a Bundle of Sticks. Most of our viewers are not necessarily political scientists. What do you mean when you say race is a bundle of sticks, and why is it important to think of race that way?
Yeah, so let me begin first with a puzzle, and then sort of explain how we landed at race as a bundle of sticks. So the core question in some ways was, can we estimate an effect of race, right? We know race is profoundly shapes people's lives, but in a kind of very careful world of trying to estimate cause and effect in kind of statistics and political methodology and econometrics, these kind of very quantitative fields, people said, well, if you can't experimentally manipulate something, you can't talk about an effect of it, right? The kind of bumper sticker slogan is no causation without manipulation.
Where do I get that bumper sticker?
yeah, dorkiest bumper sticker ever.
Yeah.
And so the idea is, if you can't sort of randomly assign some people to be, to get the blue pill and some people to get the green pill, you can't actually talk about an effect of the pill. And of course, we can't randomly assign some people to be black and some people to be white in any meaningful sense. We can't randomly assign some people to be male and some people to be female. These are attributes that people are largely born with and are, exceedingly hard to, if you think about some, a whole suite of features that are attributes of a person, but also life experience, things like culture, things like, maybe the neighborhood you grew up in. I mean, it's this huge set of things that produce an experience of what it is to be an African American or a Native American, right? And so how might we talk about trying to estimate an effect when it's hard to even know what we're talking about? Are you talking about neighborhood? Are you talking about class? Are you talking about wealth inequality? And so what we tried to do in this paper is to say, well, in some ways, the kind of traditional way of thinking about race, and by traditional here, I mean sort of the quantitative school, had a kind of old school model of race, which is deeply biological. Right. And in the humanities and in a lot of the, it feels like anthropology, there's been, sort of there's been ideas of race as something that's much more socially constructed are much more the norm. And what we realized is that there was a kind of bridge between, or it's not even a bridge, but that when you combine those ideas of, okay, well, let's think about how might we be able to experimentally manipulate something, or at least analogize to that, and draw on this literature that says, we need to think about race as a social construction, then it becomes possible to think about, oh, well, maybe these two kind of fields that don't often talk to each other actually have a lot to contribute together. And what we can do is say, well, much of, if we think about a kind of a classic study that estimates discrimination, you're putting names that are, kind of stereotypically black or stereotypically white on a resume.
Right.
Right. Well, what is that doing? And we're not actually randomly assigning black people to the resume. We're not assigning white people to the resume. It's a signal, right? The name evokes in somebody's mind all sorts of associations with what it means to be white or black. And if we think about the name then as kind of one element of what it means to be white or black, we could sort of say, oh, well, there are lots of elements. There are lots of kind of things that are signals of race. And we can use those signals to approximate things like, even a small amount of information can convey a huge amount of, in people's minds, they can create, oh, this is somebody Latino, and then they may or may not discriminate on the basis of that. So we can use information as a signal and use lots of different elements of race as different kinds of signals. So that's kind of the basic idea, and that allows us to reconcile this sort of more cautious quantitative field with the kind of humanities races much more constructed in ways that allow us to actually talk about effects of race, or at least elements of what make race meaningful in the world.
And what are some of those information signals? You mentioned names on a resume. Is that kind of the standard in that area, or what else might you use to signal this suite of attributes or experiences?
So part of what was so fun for me about this paper was once the logic of it clicked for me, and to be clear, that these are, in some ways, these are ideas that are these are not new ideas in like Black literature. You can read a book like Diary of an Ex-Colored Man, where he's playing with race, and when he speaks Spanish as a jazz musician in Miami, he sort of like passes for like Cuban, right? And so I mean, I want to be clear that there's like a long history of this, but it hasn't been kind of braided in with like quantitative causal inference and statistical methods. But so part of what was fun was to sort of draw on that and say, okay, well, once you think about this bundle of elements, like what else are there? It's like, well, dialect, right? So I started looking, are there papers that try to randomly assign dialect, right? A lot of how we kind of make sense of somebody's background is just like, is in very subtle cues about language. And I found a paper of a linguist at Stanford who randomly assigned people to ask realtors to set up appointments. And some people would speak Chicano standard English. Some people would be Black standard English. Some people speak, sort of American standard English. And so you were getting, he's very careful in the paper. He's identifying dialectical discrimination, but it's fundamentally like somebody hears that Chicano accent and they're sort of imputing, oh, you should go to this neighborhood. So there was significant discrimination on the basis of this very thin cue, right? A voice over a phone, but that was enough to like assign race and then put those people in the the Chicano neighborhood, right? And there are lots of other interesting variations. You can think about like we're right now all in a we're communicating through media, and basically anything that is mediated can often be manipulated. So one crazy study, they used avatars that would shift race while you were interacting with them.
Like of people, or avatar as in like cartoons that kind of had like emoji style changes. Do you know what I mean? Like how real life was this?
I think these were not super realistic. Okay. I mean, like one of the craziest ones is that people were doing VR, like a virtual reality world where it is more photorealistic. And in the VR world, you might be a kind of straight-laced white guy, a straight-laced Black guy, or a kind of like cool-looking Black guy. And then you were playing a drum in the thing, and they said, were people more expressive depending on who they saw themselves as? Who did white people become more expressive when they saw Black arms for them in the virtual world versus white arms, right? So I mean, you can do kooky stuff like that, and I'm not saying that getting at deep issues of like racial inequality, but it speaks to how these technologies also allow us to kind of begin to think about multiple ways race works, not all of which are just like skin color or something like that.
Well, I noticed in your VR example, and this is the only thing I will say about white people, here's hoping, is there was no cool white person option. You were like straight-laced white guy. I was like, that sounds right. But we couldn't do it. Like VR is where it is, but we couldn't do it even in VR. Well, I think that's, go ahead.
No. So it's there are lots of ways people sort of take these, and so that one other thing probably worth saying is just there's like what we observed. This is a co-authored paper. What we observed is there were lots of people doing these kinds of interesting, quirky experiments. In some cases, getting at really important kinds of discrimination in the workplace for loans. But we didn't have an idea of like what does it mean if somebody is discriminating on the basis of some relatively thin piece of information. Is that race? How do we braid that together? So that was kind of the underlying logic.
Well, I think the contributions are multifold, but for folks who don't spend a lot of time thinking about empirically measuring race, this is extremely sophisticated, and a lot of political scientists with good intentions are like, okay, let's put Black people and white people in different rooms and have them watch different political ads and see what happens. And we're kind of left to observing and these observational studies. And so your ability to actually try to understand and to link these more qualitative realities, that it's much more than how you look, it's your life experience, et cetera, is
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what was also very powerful for me, and again, like part of the gift of that paper for me was how much I learned doing it. And one of the things that I teach statistics, and inevitably when I'm working with students, they get a data set and they want to look at, well, I want to compare white kids to black kids in this data set. And, and what's helpful for me having done this work is to be able to say, well, that's not really a meaningful comparison, right? Because you don't know whether you're picking up a wealth inequality gap. You don't know whether you're picking up, a tutoring gap. You don't know if you're picking up an access to healthcare gap. So when you say you're talking about a racial difference, what you're really picking up is this thing associated with race, and it's very imprecise, right? And so what has been helpful for me in both in teaching, but I think also more generally, is often we'll talk about something like a black-white education gap. And like, it's like, well, what does that actually mean, right? Because like from a policy perspective, are we saying we're going to try and make black kids white kids, right? That's not a meaningful intervention. But we can talk about something like your ability to read in first grade is really vital, right? And so if we do a big investment in getting you up to speed reading between kindergarten and first grade, that closes a reading gap, and that then reduces a test score gap, but it's a test score gap that's a function of something very specific, like your first grade test scores, where we can do an 8-week intervention, right? So it moves us from these sort of, in some ways, meaningless comparisons of people who have very different life experiences and not really knowing what we're picking up when we see a difference, to trying to say, okay, here's something, if kids are, some kids are more exposed to lead, that might contribute to some kind of health or educational outcome difference. But that we can make progress on.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to go all public health, but get rid of the lead. How about that? I think we are all, many of us are, I imagine most people watching this show are posting statistics left and right, especially this week, about these gaps in income and health outcomes among Black, white, or Black and non-Black people in this country. And I hope they are joining me in thinking, well, what can we learn from that, right? What is it about, what aspect of race are we really picking up? I want to flag for a second. I forgot to say this at the beginning. I said we're raising money for Black Lives Matter during this show. I wanted to thank those who've already donated before the show even started. Through Eventbrite registrations, we made over $400, and another 150 have come in since the show started. All of these are going straight to Black Lives Matter. You can donate using the link in the chat or using the link in the comment section. And this is also a Q&A show, so I have an eye on the live chat, and I will fold in questions from our audience as they come. But let's jump to your protest paper. 1960s Black protests and their effect on political change. What's the effect? Give away the punchline.
So let's again start like really big picture, right? So in political science, most of political science says marginal groups have no influence, right? That like the kind of, the bumper sticker there is elites dominate politics. And this is, like largely true. If we look at whose interests get reflected in policy, it's much more the wealthy than the poor. It's much more the lobbyists than the protesters. But the kind of consensus view that there's sort of no voice for these outside groups has been challenged. Excuse me. And I'm part of a kind of a small number of scholars who are saying, let's look at how outsiders get heard. And so I looked at, in particular, kind of the question I started to ask was, well, how do subordinate groups, and here I'm using subordinate groups as a kind of, again, a sort of slightly technical term, as a general way of saying, most kind of modern societies are somewhat stratified. There are, again, elites and people who are not elites. So those non-elites, the subordinate groups, the ones sort of toward the bottom, how do they make their voices heard? And protest is obviously one of the most common ways. And so started looking at the political consequences of protest. And I think it's important to note that protests can work in a variety of ways. So I was just writing about the Montgomery bus boycott, right? And boycotts are one way that activists can really do powerful things. Montgomery bus boycott, 381 days of people walking miles, and they break the back of Jim Crow bus segregation. I mean, it's just an astonishing accomplishment. But what I was interested in is a kind of a different mechanism, which is through the media. And what I found is that there's a certain kind of protest that gets media attention, and that media attention actually shapes public opinion. And so if you can get a disruption on the ground that is sufficiently, sort of mediagenic, then you get headlines about your protest, and that can in turn influence public opinion. But there's a kind of a twist, which is that the tactics matter, and not just the tactics of the protesters, but also the tactics of the police. And so just very quickly, what I find is that when in the early part of the 1960s, the civil rights movement was engaging in lots of different kinds of protests, again, things like the Montgomery bus boycott, things like peaceful protest that was relatively, sort of uneventful in the sense that something like the March on Washington is a huge event, but it's not. When the New York Times wrote about it, they said, the greatest redress of grievances this nation has ever seen, and there was no violence, right? That's like right out of their mouth. But the civil rights movement also figured out that if they were nonviolent and police or vigilantes engaged in violence against protesters, that was something that the media got really, I don't want to say excited, but paid a lot of attention to, because it's dramatic, right? And the media have interests which are in good images and things that are going to grow audiences and things that are going to kind of build potentially their revenue, and so dramatic images were a very powerful way of getting the media interested. And so and this was even though I kind of been steeped in a lot of this history, was surprised to learn how strategic the nonviolent kind of civil rights movement leaders were in picking cities like Selma and Birmingham, where they knew that police chief had a hair trigger for violence and was likely to engage in these kind of spectacles of violence that would make them the objects, the targets of violence on camera. I'm going to go into one more bit of detail about this, which is one challenge of just the kind of nonviolent protest and the kind of the peaceful, if the state is relatively restrained and people go out and they protest, you might even get some press. I mean, I find they do get press, but for the white moderates outside of the South, a protest that is peaceful looks like normal politics. It looks like, hey, the system's working. Why do we need to, kind of get moved to action? But if you have children, being hit with fire hoses, that, in the language of the 60s, shocked the conscience of the nation. And suddenly the kind of the fence sitters no longer felt comfortable just being on the fence. And so that combination of nonviolent resistance combined with brutal state repression really powerfully moved the country against Jim Crow. So that's the kind of early wave of tactics. And then I look at the second wave of the 60s, where there's more protests that escalate to violence, more Black-led protests that escalate to violence, so commonly called like urban riots in the mid to late 60s. And there, what I find is public opinion, newspapers, instead of focusing on civil rights, they focus on riots. Public opinion concern about crime and riots ebbs and flows as the protest activity is happening, as the newspaper coverage goes up and down on covering riots. And that really drives, public opinion to be more concerned about crime. And I find ultimately helps Richard Nixon win the 1968 presidential election on a law and order campaign.
So there's a lot to talk about here. And Drex, what you're describing, I know is taking place in the 1960s. So much of it, apart from the word Nixon, really sounds like it could just be right now.
Yeah.
And for all I know, Nixon's somehow involved in right now because, whatever, his ex campaign would find it doesn't. This is off the rails. I want to ask you, Drex, how some of this is mapping to what you're seeing in the protests.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I agree with you, but I also disagree with you in a weird way, right? Because I feel like the point that you made, that the peaceful protests and no reaction to them would just be a symbol of democracy working, right? Is you see a peaceful protest, you see nothing happening, and then that's democracy working. Do you feel like in this particular instance, considering we've been peacefully protesting since Trayvon, that maybe a peaceful protest, we might be beyond that as a country, and maybe the rioting and the looting, no matter which side you fall on it, may be more of a hair trigger to society to really do something. Because I feel like at this point we've seen enough violence and nothing has happened, right? We've seen enough violence to people who haven't done anything, people who are in their homes sleeping, who are, we saw the Amy Cooper video, which I feel like is an act of verbal violence in a weird way, right? And nothing really gets done. We get a little outrage for a few days, and then it kind of all goes away. Do you think that without any of the more violent protests happening recently, that we would have had the same result or a different result than what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, so let me agree with everything you're saying, and add then one additional detail. So my work definitely finds that violence is an amplifier, and that violence as an amplifier this is not my original finding. There's a scholar, Dan Gillian, who has done a lot of work on thinking about protest as an information cue, where it sends a signal, and the building going up in flames says, we're that much more serious about, kind of conveying our message. So my work also finds violence as an amplifier. And so I don't disagree with that. Let me also say there's work by some political scientists whose work I admire, Ryan Enos, Aaron Kaufman, and Melissa Sands, that finds after LA 92, after the uprising in LA, there was some evidence of both a mobilizing effect, more people registered, and there was a kind of liberalizing effect on some education policy. People voted more liberally. So, I am entirely persuaded that there are a mix of effects. Some of them are going to be violence may produce some advantages, but I also think it's complicated, and so let me go through a little bit of where I think that complexity comes in, right? So one thing I've been hearing a lot on Twitter lately, and I'm kind of working on this right now, so it's like really top of mind for me, is some version of nonviolence never works, right? And so you didn't quite say that, but I'm just gonna I'm gonna hold you to the, hey, we've been protesting since Trayvon and nothing's happened,
right?
And I want to flag that actually that's not, I don't think that's right. So for example, in multiple cities, we've seen reform-minded DAs get elected, right? That's a post-Black Lives Matter effect. And it's a real break from decades of tough on crime policy, where basically Republicans ran on tough on crime and Democrats, kind of like waffle, trying to be sometimes tougher, sometimes a little bit less tough, but still like they had no effective response. And I think it's only in the post-Black Lives Matter moment that someone like Bill de Blasio, who's not a very popular figure right now, but he runs against stop and frisk and wins, right? That doesn't happen in an earlier era. You're the soft on crime Democrat, like you're just dead in the water. And we also see changes in use of force policies in a bunch of police forces around the country. Again, really important post-Black Lives Matter effects that I think are often unseen. Use of force policies are like really influential on like how police, when is it okay to use certain kinds of tactics? And it matters a lot for, protecting people from indiscriminate force. It's super boring. And so it's like not the kind of thing that gets a lot of attention, right? So let's just kind of bracket the possibility, at least, that there actually has been significant change. Let us also agree that there's nowhere near enough, right? So it might be that violence is a kind of an accelerator, and that in being an accelerator, maybe that's okay. But I also want to, I want to not let the nonviolence doesn't work meme to like persist, because again, Montgomery bus boycott, March on Washington within a year. If you look at public opinion, March on Washington, like again, super boring as a yeah. I mean, obviously King gives his speech. I don't mean to say super boring, but it's not. There's no
boring,
violence.
Yeah. Oh God.
Yeah.
That clip is not going to be good afterwards. Sorry about that.
But national public opinion follows that march. It becomes the most important problem in civil rights becomes the most important problem in America. And within a year, we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? So like landmark legislation following that. Selma, protesters are nonviolent. State is like crazy violent. That gets broadcast nationally, like weird detail. The Nuremberg, there's a documentary about the Nuremberg trials, like Nazi war crimes. They cut into that to show people like Representative John Lewis being beaten by white supremacist vigilantes in the South, right? So it's just like people are like, oh, wait a minute, I thought we were the good guys fighting the Nazis, and then it cuts to what's going on in the South. Public opinion on civil rights spikes like a, I mean, it just goes straight up, and within 5 months we get the Voting Rights Act, right? So I think it's just important not to concede that nonviolence is ineffective. And that doesn't mean that violence might not be advantageous in some other context, but so let's kind of uncouple, is nonviolence possibly effective? Lots of evidence it is.
Right.
Is violence possibly effective? Some evidence that it is. And then I think some additional evidence that it may play out in kind of funny ways. So it may be that elites, and we see this cross-nationally, people, it's like all these corporations and, like the universities saying, Black Lives Matter, and like, that's great. I'm thrilled by that. But it may be that elites respond one way and that like the white masses respond another way. And that is like an important bit of calculus to consider. And what I observed in the 1960s is, 81% of Americans, country's 90% white, so 81% of Americans is almost all white people, some African Americans, and some Asian American Latinos, right? But basically, 81% of Americans said law and order has broken down in society. That's not just urban unrest, that's assassinations and other things. But in that context, Hubert Humphrey, who's the lead author of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, is competing against a guy who's running on law and order, who starts the war on drugs, right? Richard Nixon, and Humphrey loses, right? And so I think the hard math is, if you could have some benefits of let's talk about. We can go into more details. I won't go into that level right now. But it's like let's assume that there are a bunch of good things that come from the violent protests in the 60s, and there is evidence that there are some things. And let's also assume that mobilizes a group of folks to defect from the Civil Rights Coalition to the Law and Order Coalition, and helps to build a durable coalition on the right for the very kinds of tough on crime policies we're now protesting. Right. And so that to me is the kind of hard trade-off. And so I think the puzzle is, well, can you get most of what you want with nonviolence without the risk of this blowback? And I think there's good evidence that that's possible.
Okay. You've talked a lot, Omar, about the role of the media, and as I didn't know this word until this show. Mediagenic is not something that I have ever thought of before, but it's a beautiful word. We have a question here from someone in the audience, from Krisha. Does the media work the same way? So the media picks up something, and that can be amplifying to the protest. What does the role of social media in that? And that's where I'm going with this question. But before I get to that, Drex, I'm curious. I imagine at the protests that you've been at, social media is everywhere. Are you in places? I mean, Union Square was packed with media. I mean, how involved? What is it like with the media, interacting with the media right now?
The media, it's very interesting because in some instances, in some cases, the media tends to show up more towards the evening time. It's almost as if they're missing the daytime protests, the footwork, and okay, we gotta maneuver traffic. We gotta make sure these cars get through, but we also gotta make sure our voices are heard. We gotta, they're missing that, and it's almost as if they're waiting for the sensationalism, right? Because what news is that everyone's doing fine and we're marching peacefully? That's not something that you want to put up. They want to see the video of the cop cars hitting the protesters, or the people getting beaten, and even then, some of that's not even making the news until they're watching reporters get hit now. So I tend to don't see the media during the day. I tend to start seeing them towards the evening time, as if they're waiting for that hot news story of the police going against the protesters or the looting, And part of me is disgusted by that, but part of me says that, well, if there's more people there to see the cops do the things that we've been saying that these cops have been doing for so long, then hopefully that incites, these middle Americans who believe that everything's okay and everything's perfect to say, well, maybe there is a problem here. So I'm kind of torn on that,
And I think I think with good reason, and to be clear, like in the 60s, in the South, most of the media is pro-segregation, and outside of the South, the media is essentially like, doesn't pay any attention to Black concerns, and so I'm not suggesting it's that way now, but part of the logic of engaging in disruption that encapsulated the kind of larger injustice in a single conflict, somebody, a cop hitting a child or a young man or something, is to kind of to punch through that national indifference, right? And I think you are right. Again, going back to your point about maybe violence is helpful. Like it definitely like gets everybody to pay attention, and you are absolutely right that, I think part of what was, it may seem obvious to people, but it was a bit of a revelation for me, because I didn't start out this work thinking about media. And it was sort of, I realized, like the media has its own interests, right? Like the media, I used to work in TV news in New York, and so, in local news, and like people were great, but it was like, I used to be a tech reporter, right? You showed the Oprah clip, and I remember when Wi-Fi came out, I was like, oh, this is like so awesome. Let me report on Wi-Fi. And I was doing both radio and TV at the time. And radio was like, great, we'll, like give us some questions and we'll like, put together a script. And TV was like, what are we going to show? What's the visual? And I was like, it's the coolest, like, being in the internet in like a couple of years. Yeah. Like, I got no visual for you. Yeah. And it wasn't until a year later. What does Wi-Fi look
like? That's like a deep question. Yeah. Okay.
It wasn't until a year and change later that like I got to do a segment on Wi-Fi, because like there was Wi-Fi at McDonald's, right? And that like the logic of media as a kind of customer for the protest can create some perverse incentives for the protests. It creates, like the car on fire is not substantively meaningful if we're talking about decades of systematic violence by the police against Black people. But it's really good TV. It's really visual, and so I think like, in some ways, part of I've been trying to think about how can I translate my results into a way that makes them more accessible. And one of them is I want protesters to think like news producers, and then sort of what would you do then? And to be clear, the only people, it's not that there are other groups that have figured stuff out like this, right? So ACT UP, also in New York. There were lots of people who came out of the theater community who had backgrounds in things like set design and costumes, and they did very elaborate spectacles that didn't leverage violence necessarily as the way. I mean, sometimes there were conflicts with police. So I'm not saying everything was peaceful, but there were definitely events that they put a condom over Jesse Helms, this very homophobic senator. They put a condom over his home. Right. And they had, national news there. And, they made very clear, like there was no property damage, but it was like a spectacle that's both funny and brings him down a notch. And so there are ways to create spectacle that don't involve violence. But in the 1960s, the media was so indifferent or hostile that you really needed something dramatic to punch through. And that's hard today, because as you're noting, Drex, it's like, nobody covers the plane that lands.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So as I know many folks in the circus community in New York City, so if we wanted to get some spectacle going with props and costumes, DM me or shout out in the chats, and we're going to get some nonviolent spectacle. I want to fold in two related questions. So what's the role of social media in all of this? And then another question from Rob Roy saying that in the 60s, we all watched more or less the same newscaster. How does it affect, even within traditional media, the fact that we can choose our channels? How does this affect your, interact with your findings?
Yeah, so I think it's a big open question how a model in which protesters and media are interacting is going to play out now. So I think one thing that's clearly true is I think some of the core kind of narrative logic of how these things get represented remains the same. And what I mean by that is there are kind of two stories. There's a rights story. Is this a legitimate redress of grievances event or a crime story? And what's also especially hard is that when you've got a kind of crime story, a mob engaging in collective violence, it's drawing on, these are both drawing on deep kind of American mythology. So one is like Boston Tea Party and, the fight for rights. And another is hundreds of years of representing African-American life as lawless, right? And that's like super accessible in American culture. It's like these stereotypes run so deep. And so the media doesn't even have to do much to kind of like invoke all of that history, right? Now, one thing that's really different now is these are much more multiracial than, the kind of the core Southern civil rights protests. And then to the social media point, like we're going to see totally fragmented experiences that differ a lot, right? So you can go and look at, there's a lawyer, actually a conservative named Greg Doucette, who's compiled 250 video clips of what appear to be excess violence, excess force used by police. I mean, and it's like, as a colleague of mine at Princeton, a historian named Kevin Cruz describes it, there's this term police riot, right? And that what we're observing in these cell phone clips is a level of repression by police that is again, like echoing the stuff in the South, kind of shocking to the conscience if you look at it. And so that echoes those kinds of efforts to produce those moments in the past. But of course, if you watch more right-leaning media, you're probably not going to see those clips. Or if your friends are more right of center, maybe you're getting more of a Blue Lives Matter story than a Black Lives Matter story. So I think it's unclear. One last thing I'll say is there's a poll from Monmouth that just came out recently. And what it suggests is that even when people disagree with the tactics of the protesters, a majority sympathize with the anger of the protesters. They think the anger is legitimate. And we've seen a big jump in people among white people. They're endorsing the statement that like African Americans are treated differentially by the police. Mm-hmm. So that suggests that maybe more of the rights narrative is predominating. But it's hard. It's just early, and it's hard to know.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that it's very. This is a culmination of a lot of things, right? Like I'm glad we've gotten to the moment where a lot of people say this incident was wrong, because I think a lot of the incidents prior, it was like, okay, but was he doing this? Did he do this? Was she doing that? And so then there was a way of like discrediting, but this is an 8-minute video of someone getting their life taken. And so for a lot of people, it was like, yes, this is wrong, but I think then it became a filter of like, okay, then what do we do about it, right? And then that's where people are starting to differ. And I think that's a culmination of the fact that social media has become very insular, right? So you can surround yourself with people who agree with you, right? And you can delete and completely excommunicate the ones who don't. And when you have that over years and years and years and years and years, the only information that you receive is the information that affirms the views that you already have, right? And so that is kind of what we're seeing on our Facebooks and our Instagrams. We see a lot of people, and it looks like so many of us are in solidarity, but then you get on Twitter where it's just everybody's tweets and everybody, and you go,
oh, those hashtags, man, yeah.
Right, there's so many people who disagree with me. Or you get on Facebook and you're like, but we went to high school together. What do you do?
Right.
And so you're seeing all of these different ideologies kind of come into play. And rather than like fighting those ideologies, what do? We just delete or we block and continue to surround ourselves with the people and the ideas that match ours. And I don't know if this is the time to really be going after the people who differ from us and really try to have that constructive conversation, because it's so raw right now. But
yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Sorry.
Go ahead. But I think that
I think this to me is like where. So I think part of what's so powerful, what you just said, is it speaks to the possibility that there might be people who are persuadable. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen, I think, again, you're exactly right. The video of George Floyd being killed has moved there are people, police forces, Fox News hosts who said that's beyond the pale, right? And so there's something particular about just the kind of details of that police killing that have been, and I think in some ways it's subtle things. We see his face. We see him fighting for his life. We see him cry for his mother, right? We just haven't had, and we see the kind of astonishingly, almost like sociopathic indifference of the guy with his knee on his neck. And it sort of encapsulates in a small video something about the vastness of systemic racism. But to your point about, should you engage with that like high school person? I had this exact same experience on Facebook. It was some like really annoying post. I'm like, who is this person? It's like, oh, I went to elementary school with this person. What do I do? I think we often forget that there are persuadable people, right? And I think the video is an indicator of there may be people who are not, they're not like down for the fight. They're not, racial equality is not their top issue, but they're not necessarily like all in for racial hierarchy or white supremacy either. And that's what we see in the 60s. There are a bunch of essentially white moderates who vote for the Democratic Party right after the Civil Rights Act, right? They're not voting against the party of racial equality, but they do join the Law and Order coalition later. And whether or not we endorse violence as a method, I think it's important to remember that there are these persuadable parts of our coalition, or potential members of a kind of a coalition for racial equality, and that those potential members of the coalition are kind of hearing our rhetoric in a variety of forms. One of them is what you're saying on Facebook, but another is like, what do they see when they turn on CNN? What do they see? And what we saw this past weekend is like, the ratings for the cable networks were huge. And so in a way, for me, protest is a kind of rhetoric. It is an opportunity to grow your coalition. It's an opportunity to persuade people who are open-minded. And that is one of the great advantages of nonviolent tactics, is we can keep our eyes on George Floyd. We can say, pay attention to that. That is what you should be prioritizing. And as the tactics get more chaotic, the conversation shifts, right? Now we're talking about a burning building or and it's like as long as our eyes are on state violence, I think our coalition grows. And that to me is kind of the heart of the case that can be made on behalf of nonviolence. It keeps our eyes on the injustice, and has the potential to build winning coalitions that can then do things like enact legislation or enact I'm forgetting the term now, the federal government when a police force violates civil rights, a consent decree. When you have a winning coalition, you can suddenly begin to exert some power.
We have a question from Kyle, who's viewing, who wants to know, how can we make people see these acts of violence without re-traumatizing Black people?
I can't watch some of these
Don't
videos.
follow me for a while? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk to my high school white friends for a second. Everyone look away. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to my mind, I don't think I think of that as my job to manage my feed, right? And if somebody posts like I don't want to call it like a snuff film, because there's a kind of like these things are in some ways sacred too. But I can't watch some of them, and it took me a good week to build the nerve to watch the George Floyd one, but I don't think I know different people have different attitudes, but from my perspective, that's not your job to manage. I can choose to click or not, and I don't, and in some ways it's one of these weird things that we now live in a world where part of the etiquette we don't have, because it's all so new, is what's the etiquette of posting murder videos, right? The police killing videos, right? It's just like a crazy place to be. And at the same time, the gift of everybody having a cell phone in their pocket and a video camera in their pocket is that what was so unusual in 1992 about the beating of Rodney King being documented is now becoming something that sort of forces the rest of the world to like see what Black America has seen for a long time, which is there are these profound inequities.
It's really tough because I don't want to see these videos, right? But at the same time, though, it's predominantly fallen on Black people to report crimes against Black people, right? Like the Ahmaud Arbery thing went quiet until the video came out, and then we had to pass that video around. The Amy Cooper video started going viral because we made it viral. You know, the George Floyd video went viral because we made it viral, and the news media outlets started picking it up. And had we not taken the time to ensure that those things went viral, then we wouldn't even be having this discussion right now, because it would have been just another one of those cases that kind of dipped off and went away. I wish that responsibility wasn't on us, and hopefully moving forward, since there are so many people with cameras and there are so many people at these protests that don't look like us, maybe that responsibility doesn't necessarily have to fall on us all the time to ensure that the opportunity for justice is allotted to us after we pass, before we pass, after these incidences, right? But as of right now, it still feels like it's our responsibility to make sure that these names are heard, that these hashtags are passed around until some type of justice reform happens, so that we don't have to anymore. So,
I do know that there are some outlets, and I'm going to get the name wrong if it's off the top of my head. It's like the Brooklyn Movement Center, Brooklyn Movement Collective, one of many organizations that offers training to Black folks and non-Black folks about how to film a police interaction if you are seeing it. And so you can look into trainings if you are not a Black person on how to be an ally if you're around such a thing. It still requires that thing to happen, which is horrible. And we wish we weren't in a situation where that was something that was even a meaningful strategy. I want to flag, we've made $850 now for Black Lives Matter. Thank you everyone who's donating. You can keep donating with the link in the comments and at the top of the live chat. I think we all agree that massive changes are needed. And Omar, your work underscores really long-lasting effects that these protests had. And kind of the big moving pieces, did the media pick it up? How did it cover it? Were these protests violent or not violent? Violent because the police started it and therefore protesters were reacting, versus violent because the protesters were violent. These are all different moving parts. And I'm curious, just given your expertise, what do we all do going forward? Do we increase the spectacle? Do we keep filming everything that's happening? What's the most effective from your perspective?
Well, so if we think like the media, again, there are things like boycotts that can be effective, but in an era where the media is so pervasive and powerful, we want to at least consider what are the interests of the media and how can people use them to their advantage, right? And so there are a variety of things that can, I think, be effective, right? So, some of the dramatic footage that we're seeing make the news is of, the CNN footage of reporters being arrested is astonishing, right? And it speaks to the sort of thing where you're like, oh, I thought we were in a democracy. That seems kind of authoritarian, right? And small things like that do a lot of work, is what my work suggests, right? That this kind of, drip, drip, drip of rights are at risk or rights are at play actually can move the majority of the country, right? And so what I think, so documenting what's going on matters, but also, you two know theater better than I do, right? In some ways, the protest is putting on a show. And the question is that show going to highlight, vandalism at a Starbucks? Or is that show going to put a spotlight on the injustice against George Floyd, right? And I'm not enough of a theater person to have really creative ideas about what are the ways that might be done beyond the walk, but even the walk matters. I think it, and I hear you, Drex, that the media aren't interested in the walk, and that's what we saw in the 1960s too, right? There's a reporter who says this unprecedentedly large protest in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, it's dull, right? Blood and guts are news. But there are things like die-ins, there are things like the body bags outside of the White House when the pandemic was going on. There are things like dramatic images of a single person, a nurse in front of an SUV, right? If you think like a camera, then there you start to sort of say, oh, there are other kinds of ways we might be able to get our message to the world. In the film How to Survive a Plague, which is about ACT UP, which I highly recommend, there's a woman named Ann Northrup who had been a TV news producer who leaves TV news to go work with ACT UP. And she has this great line in the film where she says, "Don't talk to the media, talk through the media." Right. And so the question is, how do protesters kind of sort of use the media again to kind of amplify a message? And of course, it's really hard right now. One other effect of cell phones is, you know, a text or a tweet or whatever goes out, and like suddenly you've got thousands of people who are not, you know, who don't have training, they're not connected to an organization, they haven't worked with an organizer, and their organizers doing amazing work holding it together. But it's so spontaneous that of course there's going to be some chaos, and that just makes it really hard to deliver a coherent message. So I think to the extent that there are like clear messages that speak through the media to the larger public, that's what, at least in the 60s, was effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just hope that I just hope that the pressure stays on this protest and this movement, because we're a very ADHD country, you know, and right now everyone's home. There's a pandemic happening, so we can all have all eyes focused on this thing right now. But I'm really praying that there's no Tiger King season 2, or, you know,
Netflix, do your part and kill it now. Yeah,
that there's no new, because I feel like a lot of, you know, with a lot of the prior protests and a lot of the prior killings, that we get upset for, you know, a week, maybe 2 weeks, something new comes up that, you know, and then it slowly fades away. And I'm really hoping that this time is the last time, and that we can really focus on some real reform and some real change this time. You know, and I've seen a lot of late night shows too, where rather than go like, this is a systemic issue, they're like, oh, this all lays its feet at Trump, which I feel like is almost like a cop out to a lot of it. So I really hope that there's a systemic change, and not just, well, we'll vote him out and then everything will be different once he's voted out, you know?
Yeah. No, I mean, part of what's so crazy about having studied protests in the 1960s, many of which were in response to police killings, is to sit with the very hard reality that like progress can happen, right? I mean, Jim Crow got broken, and progress is slow. And so I share your hope, and I'm also, you know, and I also agree fully that in the very near future, right, the like our, and that maybe not your attention, maybe not my attention, maybe not yours, Andrea, but like the country's attention will move. And so there's this relatively narrow window to do some important work. On the other hand, I think there are things like same-sex marriage or marijuana legalization where it's not just a pendulum swing, like literally the culture shifts and then the laws follow. And I think it's possible that the combination of watching the kind of the brutality, the callous brutality of the George Floyd video with maybe some of the other footage that's coming out, that more of America will say, whoa, police seem like they don't have any accountability. And that may or may not kind of stick in the culture, but it feels like that's where things are, you know, there's some sense of some awareness about that now.
Do you think that it will take something happening to a white person for that to happen? For that change?
Well, so I think, so part of it, I mean, you know, in the 60s, it definitely helped when my dad was doing voter registration in Mississippi with Freedom Summer, right? And he goes to Mississippi just at the same time that Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, two young Jewish men and a black man, get murdered by white supremacist vigilantes, right? And that absolutely captures the attention of the country. And I just, you know, I think of that moment a lot in these kinds of questions, right? And so yeah, if there's an exceptional kind of brutal killing, like something like a George Floyd or a Trayvon Martin or a Michael Brown or a, you know, Breonna Taylor, like on camera for a white person, that would matter a lot. But I think the other thing that's really important to appreciate is that whites have become more attuned to concerns about racial inequality over the last decade. Again, one more, I think, downstream consequence of Black Lives Matter protests, white liberals especially. And I think we see that in a weird kind of way that we don't even fully understand, that like these protests feel to me a bit like a kind of post Trayvon Martin generation that sort of came of age at a moment that said, whoa, seems unacceptable. And so it may be that, I mean, this is one of the other things we see in the 60s, and this is part of why I think nonviolence falls out of fashion, but are out of favor. But in some ways, it's hard for people to see how much success is actually happening kind of below the surface. And so if in fact white America, and particularly again white liberals, is becoming more attuned to concerns about racial equality, it might be that Trump is kind of part of a transitional period to where maybe we do have like a governing coalition that says racial equality is like a really important thing for decades to come. I mean, you know, I'm not going to bet on that given American history, but that's there's some evidence we're trending in that direction. And if that's the case, it doesn't necessarily have to be the white person who's a victim of police violence. It might be that there is a real wellspring of concern among enough whites that builds, you know, I mean, that builds a governing coalition. Last thing I'll say is, like, I think one of the other ways in which this work has sparked some debate is, like, people are like, why are you making, you know, the concerns of white people so central in this story? And this is something that came up in the 60s, right? Bayard Rustin is saying we need to build a coalition of blacks, white liberals, you know, union members, and white moderates. And others are like, my humanity is not contingent on the whims of a white moderate. And I'm sympathetic to both positions, of course. But if you're 13% of the population and you live in a majoritarian society, like, how do you win an election outside of like a city level election unless you're in coalition, right? And so like that's the hard math. And so you know, like, that's to me the genius of Bayard Rustin, is that he was like, he understood the hard kind of racial realpolitik of we have to build winning coalitions, and that's our path to power.
Okay.
I know we talk a lot about, you know, what do we do next? And there's no obvious good answer. I will just shout out to all white folks watching that we have a lot of work to do to persuade fellow white people that this is urgent, and it shouldn't take horrible videos to get us to take to the streets, right? We have a comment from Kyle in the audience wondering if things feel different now because of Amy Cooper, this liberal woman in Central Park who, you know, calls the police on a black person. I mean, still horrible, doesn't result in a death, really messes up people's lives, right? And maybe that's a kind of optics that that can help keep white people engaged without actually having to kill people. Hopefully having to kill people, that's not what I meant. You know, having to wait for more tragedy. You know, so maybe just white people keep fucking up, but in not so deadly ways is one way. But I will also say that I own educating white people, even liberal white people, or people who think that they are liberal. And so, you know, we have a lot of work to do, and getting Trump out of office feels like an easy fix, and that's not the fix.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that a majority of whites still support Trump. And so it's, you know, I think we are a country with two really deeply competing ideas. One is a more egalitarian idea that is a multi-ethnic, multiracial, thriving, you know, diverse society, and one that is kind of holding on to a vision of America when, as in the 1960s, it was 90% white and overwhelmingly Christian, and you know, you didn't have to worry about saying Happy Hanukkah or something, right? And we're in the middle of that kind of tug of war. And, you know, going back to kind of what gives me a little bit of optimism, I do think the trends work in favor of the egalitarian coalition, but I think it could be a 50-year transition.
And how many people have to die in those 50 years? We normally wrap up this show at 8. I promise both of you an 8 o'clock out. This is a very important conversation. I want to go a teeny tiny bit longer if that's okay with you, but if either of you need to go, I want to respect your time.
Okay.
I have a question. Jamie Thomas says that people protesting right now are not worrying about optics. It's going back to the, you know, how can we strategically use the media, et cetera. People protesting right now are not worrying about optics because Black people are dying. As an organizer, I would push back on tactics that highlight journalists in the media, a lot of whom are white. Are there tactics that maybe don't center, maybe Jamie, shout out if I'm getting your question wrong. Are there tactics that maybe don't center getting white people and journalists, to have the spotlight. Jamie, tell me if I got that wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. So so let's kind of come at this from a couple of angles. I think one really important thing that I've heard as pushback from organizers, and I totally concede the point, is that not all of activism is protesting, right? So organizing, building civic capacity, building within group capacity is a really important part of social change, and that might not involve protest at all, right? So just as boycotting is one form of activism that doesn't center the media, organizing that is about building skills and networks and kind of like knowledge is another thing that doesn't center the media. Once you're out in the public square, though, you are now like in conversation with the world, and on this sort of second point of we are grieving, we are mourning, we are angry. Why are you prioritizing journalists? I think that gets at another kind of tension, which is that for a lot of people, protest is expressive. And I've been there. I've been like angry when Eric Garner was strangled to death. Like I was at a protest in Midtown and like shouting like the next person, and it was for me a kind of like I needed to like express my anger, but that's a different kind of agenda than making, they can overlap. I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive, but that's a different kind of agenda than we have some kinds of outcomes we're trying to get to, right? We want to change policy in terms of like how a guy with 17 civilian complaints, a pattern of abuse, having, shot multiple people, how is that guy still on the force? So that if Derek Chauvin is like fired or put in a desk job, like George Floyd is alive, right? So if we're concerned about the policy side, then in some ways your expression of anger might help in terms of generating a kind of larger coalition for that reform. But fundamentally, the goal is not for you to express yourself. The goal is for us to achieve reform. And so I'm deeply sympathetic for people that need to mourn or grieve or express anger. But the expressive side of protest is a different kind of agenda than the sort of what in political science we'd say instrumental, or the like kind of like more kind of outcome focused side of things. And there, people in the 1960s were grateful when the white reporters covered the event, right? That's how you got to power. That's how you reached the country. In fact, even more than that, protesters in the 1960s in the South were organizing protests like in the morning so that footage could get flown to New York to be broadcast nationally. So I think it's important to hold the media accountable. I think it's important to like challenge media narratives that do. If there are 1,000 people who are in a peaceful protest and like 5 people engage in vandalism, like that's not the story. And so it's important to like hold media to account. It's also important to, as you were just saying before, Andrea, to like encourage white people to exhibit some agency, right? You can make choices here too. But I want to begin my story with the agency of the protesters, the people, who are trying from the bottom up to make change. And I want to look what was effective, what worked. And so if you don't want to talk to white reporters, like more power to you, but ACT UP didn't say we're only going to talk to gay reporters, right? ADAPT, a disability rights group, didn't say we're only going to talk to people who are disabled and really understand our story. That doesn't mean there isn't an additional level of insight that might come from talking to those people. But if you're trying to build a coalition, you've got to be in conversation with people who are outside of your in-group.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. But I think that our society has a way of othering, right? Where we say, well, yeah, police brutality is happening, but that's happening to you, Black people, right? But then when you show a video of like a reporter getting hit by the DC cops, or reporters getting arrested who are white, now for those people who are on the line, right? The people who are like, well, I know it's a problem, but that's something that hopefully you guys make it through. Now go, oh, okay, maybe they do have too much power, because like, what if that was my son reporting, or what if that was my neighbor, reporting? And maybe there could be something that, again, it's for those reachable people, right? The ones who notoriously have been on a side or more moderate, and then and then they see something happen that's outside of this concrete structure of what they know for their argument, and then it allows them to be a little bit more flexible in that argument and maybe go, okay, maybe certain issues may still be your issue, but we can at least reform something in the police to make it so that police can't hit reporters, or police can't hit people, anybody at all. If this is an all lives matter issue, police can't, use too much force on anybody, not just a black issue, right? And then also, I feel like sometimes focusing on certain things that only affect that, or not necessarily only affect white people, but affect white people, are very important. Like, I think the Amy Cooper video, one, really helped this kind of blow up, because you saw what this could look like, right? And then you see exactly what that did, right? But with the Amy Cooper video, I think a lot of the times, for a long time, I've been trying to explain to like white counterparts that like a lot of these people who call the police know exactly what they're doing when they call the police on a black person, no matter what the offense is, or if there's no offense at all, right? And a lot of the argument and the narrative before has been, well, I mean, when they called the police, I'm pretty sure they didn't know the cops would be that much of a threat, or the cops wouldn't do X, Y, and Z to that person. But to see this video of what looks like a liberal white woman saying, I know that if I say African-American male threatening me, that I am putting something about your life in danger. I think that opened up more of a conversation to the white people who lived in this world where everything was okay, more so than it opened a conversation for us who have seen this before, have lived this before, and have been trying to explain this to people who truly don't understand. So, as far as seeing white people in the media, or seeing the effects of white people on the media during these particular protests, I think it's just as important, if not more important, to reach those middle people, those moderates, than it would be to show a video of another one of us getting killed. So,
I think it's that's really well stated, and just to underline some of what you said, right? In the '60s, white vigilantes would attack the press in these civil rights protests, and who does the press sympathize with? It's like, that's in some ways the best thing for your cause, is for the opposition to attack the press. I mean, not to the point that like people get. I'm not saying I want anybody to get hurt, but at some level, this is about storytelling, and the media are the conduit through which those stories get told. And when their cameras get smashed, like that gives them a stake in the game, and that can be really powerful.
It's definitely, it's I have seen white people over the last week go all kinds of crazy trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, and it's, we saw that with Blackout Tuesday, but we see, I better shut up and not center myself, which is the opposite. If the point is to get in front of, get hit by police and get that on camera so that people care, speak up about the things that we are doing, that we see ourselves in the Amy Coopers of the world. We are all Amy Cooper, right? And to step up and recognize that and speak out about it. But at the same time, and I leave this to an offline conversation with my fellow white allies, or trying to be allies, is, how do we make sure that we can use our privilege for good without continuing to replicate the structure that gave us that privilege in the first place? As long as it takes a white person to get hurt or to speak it out in a protest and get on camera, or a white reporter to be hit or something like that, then aren't we just perpetuating the problem? Or is it better to just get people thinking about it and caring about it and saying, this is my problem too, it's not just the other Drex, as you correctly pointed out, and then we'll work on not having to be, not taking our caring and our involvement for it to matter.
What do you think, Drex?
I mean, at this point, right, it's almost like whatever gets the job done, right? But right. I think that you can use your privilege for good without making you the center of the story, right? Like, even at these protests, when there are confrontations with the police, a lot of the white protesters will move to the front because there's an underlying knowledge that the police will take just that much longer to attack them than it would for them to just hit one of us at the front of the line, right? And I had to deal with this week too, where I've had like a lot of white friends hit me up and say like, how do I help you? I don't know how to help. I don't know if it's sending you love. I don't know how to help you out. And I think that just like this show, right? And you having these conversations, this is extremely helpful. This is what we need, right? But I think a lot of people will take something and say, well, I did my good deed. Right? This is about me doing a good deed. This is me showing you I'm not racist, rather than this is me showing you that there's an issue happening where we need to solve it. You know, so it's about using that privilege, but it's about using that privilege for the right reason with the right people in mind, and really taking yourself out of the narrative in using that in the first place.
Yeah, I agree fully. My wife has had some health issues, and we had, you know, some privilege in that, like, we were, you know, when we met in graduate school at Harvard, and like had just some kind of capacity to sort of take, you know, we did a Kickstarter, we were able to raise some money. She did a documentary, and people kept saying, make the documentary about you, because you're this like compelling couple. And I didn't fully understand, you know, and to be clear, this is not a real high stakes kind of privilege, right? You're the like least sick of a group of sick people. And to be clear, she was bedbound for years. So even then it wasn't like, this is not winning any lottery. But she had this real insight that it was like, I can't just be about me. And she made so the film follows like multiple families, and you get a sense of like, what's this experience in different countries and different like contexts, different classes. And so I think, just echoing what Drex said, there's an element of sharing the stage that's going to use your power, but bring, you know, new voices, new people along with you. And what that means in different contexts, you know, will differ. But I think, you know, I think in some ways, maybe the first thing is for people to even recognize they have all of this privilege that they're not deploying, right? Like, you could spend $100,000 on, you know, that car, or you could potentially do something that would materially change a lot of people's lives, right? And it's like, you need the fancy car? I don't know. Maybe, you know, and we're all guilty of this at some level. But thinking about where are those places where at the margin you might be able to actually, you know, do something that comes at some cost to you and has some, you know, really substantial benefit for people who are worse off.
So normally I end shows with a tidy wrap up of all the things we learned and our marching orders, no pun intended, going forward. But I feel as though we haven't solved this one. I don't know what you two think. There might be one or two follow-up discussions to be had about this one. But I do want to be sensitive to everybody's time. I will say to the white folks, non-Black folks watching, get in touch with me. I am collecting resources. Many folks are collecting resources for things that we can do. And it's I personally think it's everyday small actions. It's not, you know, just blaming the police. The police are a huge problem, but we are all guilty of a lot of the things that we're seeing in the world that we are slowly coming around to recognizing are not okay, and urgently so. So I won't burden the two of you with things that we can do. We all have work to do, and we have resources to work on those things. I do want to thank everyone who has watched. Our donations are now I'm trying to do math on the fly with this very terrible app, but they're around $1,100, which is awesome for Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. So thank you, everyone. I want to close with where can folks find both of you and follow your work and your thinking and your writing and your posting. Omar, you've got your Twitter handle up there, but where else can we go?
So, I mean, I have a website that's in need of some home improvement, but at omarwasso.com, and probably Twitter is the best place. There are links to the papers if you're interested in them at omarwasso.com. But that's, Twitter is where I'm probably most active.
And right on your profile, I think there are links to the papers there in the top of your profile. So just omarwasso.com right now. And those who've been watching this show for some time know I'm a very strong advocate of reading original political science research. I know I'd said there's a million amazing articles about your research, and those are definitely worth reading too. But your papers are publicly available. They're not behind a paywall. They're I learned a ton from them. There's so much more in those papers than we had time to get to today. So please read those original papers. I will be tweeting those out as well. Drex, where can folks find and follow you?
You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at thisguydrex, D-R-E-X, or you can go to my website, which also needs a lot of cleaning up, drextonclemens.com.
These shows are actually just about getting all our websites updated because mine is way behind as well. So
yeah, maybe your next show could be this old website, and it's like a home improvement show for websites.
Spoken like a true tech reporter. We'll get you and Oprah in, and we will run that show. Drex, you can come on, and we'll work. Yours will be the first project. Like, get my website up to date. I think both your websites are great.
Thank you.
Some riveting television.
Spin-off show already for Ask a Political Scientist. Ask a Political Scientist and comedian website repair. Thank you both so much for your time, your wisdom, for so generously spending. Yeah, and this week of all weeks to find the time for this is incredible, and we will be following and cheering for you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Drex, for the great questions and follow up.
Thank you for the awesome conversation.
And next week, we will be continuing the conversation. So be sure to tune in. There's been a jump around of what link to go to, but we'll make sure you can find the episode. We are here every Thursday at 7 p.m. Thank you, and good night, and stay safe, and go protest.
Okay.
Alrighty, I'm gonna.
Thank you so much. Sorry for keeping you so long.
Oh no, it's fine. Part of why the audio is a little echoey is we're in a loft space, and so if my wife has a call, I have to listen to it, and if I have something, she has to listen to it. But that was great, and thank you for including me. I'm really grateful.
It was so helpful, and I could have listened to you for 10,000 hours. So an hour and a half.
Consider, my wife can reassure you that is not the lot in life you want. But I mean, part of the gift for her of this paper coming out is that there are all these other people who want to talk to me, and she doesn't have to anymore. That had some marital benefit.
Well, tell your wife you're welcome in that case.
Yeah, and Ben, this is. I mean, you guys are, I'm sure, both involved in the production, but this is really nicely done. I'm impressed with how slick it all is.
Oh, Andrea, you should hit stop stream. It was still going.
Oh no!
Luckily, we all said nice things.
Alrighty.
Kyle just called me. Whoops, to say that. I thought she was like gonna.
Okay, with that, I'm gonna stop my cam. Bye.
Okay.